Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to Liam and the Heritage Council for today's invitation. There's a saying by Einstein that we can't solve our problems with the same thinking that created them. And I think that's the sort of keynote to all the issues and challenges that were discussed this morning and brilliantly worked out. I have to say, the innovation and the ingenuity that each speaker brought to their particular issue was outstanding. But the change that we saw and the changes in towns are absolutely people-driven. And I think one of the problems, besides changing the thinking, as Einstein said, is the disconnect that maybe modern technology has brought to a generation where virtual reality has taken over from reality. And suddenly there's a sort of realization when you go to reality, oh my God, what's wrong with my town? It's gone dead. The options have more or less created that because people have gone to live out of town. The day of the great clusters of market towns up to the 50s, 60s, 70s in Ireland were kept alive purely because people's ability to travel was decided either by the bicycle or maybe the horse and trap or those that had a car. But suddenly when cars became available to everybody and speed transport and infrastructure came, we have a thing called options. So some towns gain, some towns fail, and the same with cities. And I can only talk about Dublin because you might think that a population of 1 million or 1 million plus has advantages. It has to some extent, but it has also a huge amount of disadvantages because you've all heard of sprawling suburbs. And the city is denuded to a large extent and becomes a kind of donut effect because of sprawling suburbs. And we only heard on the news yesterday the degree of closure of the stores. What's the not Harvey Nicks, the other one?
House of Fraser.
Oh, the House of Fraser, sorry, I'd forgotten the title. 36 of them closing. And the question you ask is why? And it's because online shopping, suburban living, choice of travel from town to place to city, inward invasion of the shopping centre and so on and so on. We're not going to talk about that today, but we've got to realise sociologically what has happened to Ireland in the last 30 years, what has happened to the world. Same thing. But some countries have a greater sense of who they are, what they've come from, and what is particular to them. And I suppose Italy, France, and Spain, for those that are most familiar to us, have it in abundance. And Italy particularly because it has a sense of patrimony. And if you talk to people, you say, what's the country you like best, or what cities you like best in Europe? They usually say, oh, Florence, oh, Rome, oh, Venice, so on. And when you analyse why, you begin to realise that they still retain that wonderful sense of the individual patisserie or the local bag shop or leather maker or so on. Not that it's disappearing, because I was there quite recently and there is a disappearance of it, but they have a greater sense of realisation that it's something that once it goes is not returnable. That was the very thing that to a large extent inspired Dublin Civic Trust nearly 25 years ago to look at what was going wrong in the city. Lack of pride in buildings, disappearance of streetscape, always confrontation when something happened with the local authority, whether it was the ESB in the late 60s or 70s, building the big block in Fitzwilliam Street and taking out 17 Georgian houses. Now that the block that went in is out again, so if any of you are in Dublin, it's a vacant site. And so a group of us, coming from all kinds of backgrounds, from architecture to economists to historians, said what we've got to do is we've got to know our building stock. And that came across to me this morning, listening to everybody. It's when you found out what you had, you could come up with solutions. And so we decided that we'd set up an educational trust, and it had 3 pillars. One was to look at your building stock by inventorising, and that's something all of you could do in towns and villages. Just know what your buildings are, what age are they, what is their composition, what are the materials, how do they function, how can they be repaired, etc., and how unique are they to the area. The second one was to take on problematic buildings that would be lost to the street and already had demolition orders on them. And turn them round, in other words, give them a new life, so find new uses for old buildings. But it was also a demonstration that not alone were these buildings part of a streetscape or a setting. Everybody knows it from their own house. You usually have items in a room that make up a composition, and buildings make up that same composition on the street. And then the third one was to educate through seminars and publications and so on. So we based the buildings, because we had no money, and I listened to everybody again this morning and realised that there's very little help in Ireland. We're not like the north of Ireland or Britain, which has the Heritage Lottery Fund, which is a substantial fund, which has proven to be extraordinary in the multiplier effect in giving back both buildings but also creating employment. And we have, in fact, asked the government over the years to put aside maybe 5 million or 10 million out of our own lottery funds specifically for people who are doing restoration, because small amounts make the difference. Maybe even 10,000, 100,000, 200,000, nothing any bigger than that. But in their wisdom, it hasn't happened, but I think it would make a huge difference. So we were in the same position, and just to tell you, the solution we came up with was to have a revolving fund. And again, it's something that you could use. And my colleague Graham, who'll be going through the actual process of how we do it, will demonstrate that to you in a few moments. So all it really meant was getting the first building maybe as close to nothing as possible, and then getting through maybe grants, small grants, maybe from the Heritage Council or from the local authority. There might only be 5,000, 7,000, but they all add up. And bringing the building back to a viable use, maybe complete, maybe what we call enveloping it, just doing the outside, the roof, the windows, the appearance of it, and selling it on. There is a project at the moment called Living City. I think it applies to Galway, but it applies only to cities, Kilkenny. And it actually is very effective if used. Now, it's going to come to a conclusion in 2019. So anybody who lives in a city should try and use it, because the Department of Finance will drop it if it's not seen to be a usable or useful instrument. And that means you can amortise any of your expenditure over a period of 10 years up to 100,000 per year, which is a lot of money when you think of it. And prior to that, there were other ones which we used in the trust, and we sold on that advantage when we sold on the building to the person who bought it. But getting back to the revolving fund, it meant you brought your building up to a viable, saleable use, you put it on the market, and you reused the proceeds from the sale for the next building. So it meant you got a collection of buildings in your town or in your city, which in fact the one capital figure revolved from one to the other. And with that, we have directly done 12 buildings. We would have done an awful lot more, but the famous Celtic Tiger came into town. And what happens in Dublin, I suppose, and maybe Limerick and Cork to some extent as well, but particularly Dublin, the demand totally outstrips supply. And when it comes to buildings in the city centre or areas we'd like to work in, the prices go way beyond what makes it viable for us. So during that period of the Celtic Tiger, we kind of came to a bit of a standstill, and we're back in business again. Maybe, I think we're going into another boom again, so we may be out of business. But we're in the process of doing one, which was the residual of the capital that has either accumulated. Sometimes you get less, sometimes you get more. But what it does is it gives you that independence to act. And local authorities and heritage councils and Irish Georgian Society and people like that will give you small figures, or else you can fundraise. But at least you have that core figure which allows you to revolve. And what you usually do when you choose your building, you choose it in a way that you have an idea of what the end use might be. And listening to the Paul Gleeson, which was very inspiring, particularly from Kilrush, because it was quite similar to our kind of work. Things like Airbnb, or the other one, which is homestay, which I don't think is as tying you in as Airbnb does. But the homestay program allows you to use your 2 or your 3 rooms in your house and give that experience to the tourists, but also give an income to you and give a viability to the building. So having maybe 8 or 10, and the very nice lady from the cafe talked about it as well, where she lives, but derelict buildings in a city have that potential, or in a town, I should say, or in a village. And again, somebody else spoke there recently, the man from Portumna, saying that the American tourists, when they go to the Westports or the Cliftons or the Dingles or so on, they only meet up more Americans. And of course that happens in any town. The same happens if you go to Naples or go to Rome. You don't really get to meet Italians because any place you stay is going to be other visitors. So the potential is there. We're in the midst of completing a building. Maybe not going to get another. Dublin is going into the crazy figures again of $1 million to $1.5 million for an ordinary kind of townhouse in the middle of the city, and more if it has other multiple uses. So what we might have to do is become kind of more advisory than actually hands-on. And just one last thing which is happening sort of globally, which is going to affect Ireland in terms of policy, and that is there's a set of 17 objectives or goals, they call them, which we signed up to as a country, and so did 190 other countries 2 years ago in Paris. And they were put in place by the United Nations, called the Sustainable Development Goals. And what they're there for is how is the universe going to survive given climate change. They came in with the climate change in Paris, so they're running parallel to it. And they're looking at everything from zero poverty to resource management, to how the circular economy, how we keep putting stuff back in instead of resource management, looking at marine life. But the 10th and 11th one is looking at towns and cities. How do urban centres or urban conurbations deal with a population? And it's everything from dealing with youth to aged to water supplies, guaranteeing everything. And they're worth looking up, the Sustainable Development Goals, because the national governments and local governments will have to adapt them into their policies. And governments will have to put the equivalent budgets to make them adaptable and enforceable. So take a look at those. And I think you'll find it very reassuring as a citizen of the world that there is a greater plan for our existence, because resources are beginning to diminish and flooding is beginning to show its head, and we have a lot of issues facing us. So on that note, I'm going to ask my colleague to bring you through how we work in Dublin Civic Trust.
Great. Thank you very much, Geraldine. I think what we've seen today, the link between all of the presentations, is what is really the backbone, the building blocks of Ireland, which are these tall, skinny, narrow buildings, these street buildings that make up every town and village in Ireland. And it doesn't matter if it's Loughrea or if it's Westport or if it's the high squares in Dublin. It's the binding force of what makes Ireland look like what it is, what it looks like. And even going through Loughrea, we had to detour where the roundabout works today. And what a treat it was just to drive up the main street. And most people are probably looking at the good-looking ones walking down the pavements, and they're looking at the buildings, the one sexy shop front after another, the original stuccoed upper floors, the original glass, the original beautiful pitched roofs, and the strong Irish chimneys that individually are unremarkable, but collectively make up an extraordinary landscape. They're like letters in an alphabet. You know, they all have individual characters, and then collectively they form a language. And it doesn't matter if it's a small town or the big stuff that we're often have to deal with up in Dublin, is the same issues that are shared right around the country. And they're part of our identity. They're part of what makes Ireland what it is. And as Geraldine was saying, we've done about 10 buildings so far in Dublin over the past 21, 22 years. And this is one of the very first in early 18th century house on South Frederick Street. You can see it's a very typical example of a Dublin street building. It's not on a Georgian square, but you can see as it was before, with the brickwork in a very poor condition. And as other people have been saying, I suppose it's understanding the materials from which your buildings are built is really the key to refurbishing them in a sympathetic manner. And in Dublin, brick is the dominant material, and it's the fine jointing, the fine line jointing called wigging That's the defining characteristic of Dublin. So once you get your windows right, your brickwork right, and your pointing right, you're halfway there in terms of bringing your building back together again. There's a lot of slides here, and I've only just a few minutes, so I'll just flick through all of these buildings very quickly. But South Frederick Street number 10 was the first one that we did. Number 11 came up directly next door. Slightly later house, about 1755 or so. It had a beautiful flying staircase going up the middle of the house. So the facade was structurally stabilised, it was largely enveloped, the roof reinstated, and then the main architectural joinery work finished inside. And both houses, 20 years on, are still privately lived in and owned by private owners who are very proud of the buildings that they're based in. This was probably one of the most transformative ones that we undertook. This is one of the oldest houses in Dublin. Ainger Street is a street that long predated the Georgian city, laid out in the 1660s during the Restoration period. And as so often exists even in the typical Irish town, early buildings survive behind later facades, and this was a classic case of that. This house was built in probably the late 1660s or the early 1670s. The magnificent timber staircase still survived internally, and these buildings mark the transition from brick construction, or rather from timber construction into brick construction. So you can see the large grid work that's actually holding up the staircase going up through the building. And you can see here the carcass of the building as it was. It was literally 4 walls with this dramatic staircase rising up the centre of it. And Geraldine managed to persuade an innocent board to take it on, and what an amazing transformation it was. And then the facade had a cement, or had a lime actually render on the front of it. But it walked off, and the original, or a later facade from about 1810, the brickwork was discovered underneath. So the building was preserved back to that original state. This is one of the last buildings that we did, indeed the building that we moved from to our present project. Number 4, Castle Street, that would be familiar to a lot of you, next to the walls of Dublin Castle. It was Barnwell's shoe shop for much of the 20th century. A very classic Dublin merchant building, quite stoical and austere from the outside. Beautiful wigged brickwork on the upper facade. Lovely traditional shop front on the ground floor. And we pieced it back together. There's typically 5 materials used in these buildings: timber, brick, lime, slate, glass. And I suppose once you know the materials the building is built from, the key elements that make that building special, you're most of the way there to actually piecing it back together again. And it almost looks like a London shop front, actually. It's a very classically inspired shop front, and that's just the boardroom up on the first floor. Another building we did was number 9, Merchant's Quay. Merchant's Quay is synonymous for other reasons in Irish culture, but this beautiful house, this merchant house, even finer, fine 18th century house, was sitting languishing facing the forecourts. Most countries in the world, you would pay a premium, you would pay 10 million quid for a palazzo like this facing James Ganson's forecourts, but here it was a truncated, needle-infested house. And we reinstated the missing story, removed the render from the front, restored the brickwork, brought the windows back. Spectacular plasterwork internally. I don't have images of it. And that's the view when you're looking out the window straight over at the forecourts, the finest view in Ireland. And it's now, we did that in partnership with Dublin City Council, so they now have offices based there. And I've just rushed through our final project that we're working on now, which is another merchant building at 18 Ormond Quay, which faces directly onto the Liffey. Again, a typical Dublin 3-storey over shop house. You wouldn't touch it in a month of Sundays. It looks like a sausage factory or something that you'd see on a ring road covered in pebble dash. It looks like an industrial unit. But as ever, our eagle eye, we knew that there was a lovely Roman cement underneath the paintwork, that there was a beautiful granite shop front lurking in plain view. There was the pebble dash was cracking, and you could see lovely fine brickwork underneath. So we managed to secure it in a receivership sale. And of course, the bones of Dublin are these tall, brick, skinny Georgian buildings. And it's so often it's the squares that are looked at, Merrion Square and the Georgian landscapes on the north and south side of the river. But it's the everyday buildings in between, it's the street buildings. They're as much part of the Georgian city or the 18th century city as the grander set pieces. I'll rush through all of these, but just to show you the building is just... This is a map from 1728 showing that the North Quays were really well developed by the early 18th century. And this is the type of building that was lining the river at the time before the Georgian city came along, which are quite different to the types of buildings that we associate with the city today, with a tall, steeply pitched roof, very much typical of the London tradition of buildings at that time. So the building that we're pretty confident with, that was sitting on our site, we know there was 3 buildings on the site of the building that we bought, number 18. This is probably the very first one in 1680. We know in 1744, because we dug through our lease documentation, that the building was rebuilt, and we think it was rebuilt in a classic Dutch billy, a curvilinear gabled, of which Limerick had many, Waterford had many of this Dutch style of house. So this was the second house built on the site, and that's the very house. We often recommend that you look at historic maps because John Rock captured that building just here there on the corner. I'll just rush through these. So just to show you the job that we've done, one thing we did find quite useful was just visually modelling how the building changed over the years, because people really do respond to images very well. I'll just note that we know that the building was effectively rebuilt from scratch in 1843, and that's the building that we're dealing with today. So we're confident that it was collapsed to the ground and effectively rebuilt into its current form in 1843. And the shop front on the ground floor, which I'll just show you, is just coming together. We based that on this wonderful little line drawing. This is a drawing of Dublin streets from 1850 called Shaw's Pictorial Directory. And there's this dinky little line drawing that showed what our building looked like just 7 years after it was built in 1850. So we effectively returned the building back to its original condition as it was. And this was a good Lawrence Collection photograph showing the original layout of the facade and of the ground floor shop. So we decided to restore the building back to as it was in 1843 and to continue its existing use, which was a 3-bedroom residence over shop, a typical merchant house over shop. It was easier from a conservation point of view. It preserved all the cellular integrity of all the rooms as they were. From a fire point of view, it means that we didn't have to open Pandora's box of dealing with a new fire cert. And it just made complete logical sense that that's what these buildings were built for. That's how they perform best. So I'll just conclude now, just showing you the work that we've been doing to date. We did a lot of research in trying to find 1840s elements of Dublin shop fronts to reinstate, and we hit gold with these original cast iron grills, which we found on other Dublin streets that we've reinstated into the shop front. This is the shop front covered, which you saw earlier, covered in green paint. This is it stripped with monumental granite arches, which have been hidden in plain view for the best part of a century, with thousands of people passing by on Ormond Quay. This is just the interior of the building, which is much in its same state at the moment. We're reinstating plaster cornices, saving the ceilings, stitching up the ceilings back into their, consolidating them. I'll just this is the shop on the shop floor. Once we took up of the layers of lino that were literally holding the shop floor together for the past century, there's this beautiful merchant timber floor underneath, designed for holding sacks of tea and sugar and everything that the grocers originally had on the ground floor. We structurally consolidated a lot of the arches. This is the big expense that we had, was inserting these huge steels around each of the skinny arches on the ground floor to consolidate it, and they could then support all of the upper floors. So That wasn't a big expense. That was about 50,000 euros putting all of that steelwork in. But it makes sense in Dublin. It mightn't make sense elsewhere, but certainly for us, the figure's more than stacked up. And to put those interventions in, we had to temporarily take some items out. So this lovely vestibule had to be removed, and this is it reinstated just a couple of weeks ago. We're reinstating all the beautiful plasterwork around all of the arches. Upstairs, we double-plied all of the floors. We sensitively took up all the floorboards and laid down the new floors on top. And then just finally, the facade, the big challenge was removing all of the pebble dash from the front. And we thought this couldn't be done, but our contractors gave us confidence. And it turned out the facade had been painted before the pebble dash went on, so it fairly easily walked off. So I'll just show you that this is the pointing process, the Irish wigged jointing, which is common to a lot of Irish towns where finely gauged lines are laid out in imitation of finely gauged Dutch brickwork. The roof was pieced back together. The chimneys, which had been truncated in the 1970s, we reinstated them back to their original height. Sash windows. This was the nerve-biting week a couple of weeks ago when the scaffolding came down after nearly a year, and this is the building slowly being revealed. And this is it as it was, and this is it as it is now, as of about a fortnight ago, with the shop front restored and the upper facade brought back to its original 1843 appearance. And in many ways, it's good manners. It's just putting good manners back on streetscape. And that's what we think so much of Ireland can do: understand its buildings and do best by them, I suppose. So thank you very much.